All right. Time to talk about linear workflow. The linear workflow, the linear workflow is a very large topic, so I'm sort of assuming you know the basics of the linear workflow in this video. If you don't, there's a lot of information available on the internet for you that's up for grabs, and you can kind of do some learning. And then right now what we're going to talk about is how to work linearly in Vray. The render I have up in the video right here is incorrect. And if I view this image, this is just a photograph of some trees that I took that has been color corrected really heavily, and it's got this really saturated bluish green. And what you can see right here is that this image has become very washed out when it's mapped to the spheres. So let's close that. Vray is actually working linearly pretty nicely by default now. If I crack open my render settings, actually before we talk about the render settings, it's worth talking about just bringing this back up again. That little sRGB checkbox, that is the first step of a linear workflow, is making sure that your viewer is corrected. And so by turning that little checkbox on and bringing the gamma of my viewer up by 2.2, it's in the correct working space and is now I'm now viewing this image and the lighting correctly. Part 2 of that linear workflow is going to be making sure that images that have been input into my scene, like this photograph of the trees that I've mapped to the spheres, are in the gamma on them is corrected in an inverse manner to compensate for the lifted gamma that we need to use on the display. So Vray has a couple of options for that. The first being if I go and just open up my node editor, and let's just look at this material really quick. The easiest way to handle correcting this image is just simply going to Attributes, Vray, Texture Input Gamma. And that will go in, and let's just render half of a sphere here. And that will apply a gamma value of 0.454 repeating to the image right at the file texture input level. This is, technically speaking, a true physically correct way of dealing with the linear workflow. You can see in my file texture now, since I added that, I've got this extra Vray attributes section, and it's telling me right here, it's asking what the texture input gamma is. This is a photograph, so it's in sRGB space, so 2.2, and it's applying the inverse gamma for me. Really quickly, let's do a render. So you can see it's correct, and it looks great. The thing about adding the texture input gamma, if this file texture is going through other nodes inside Maya, for example, if I'm going and, say, using the insert color remap, which I do use quite frequently, it gets a little more complicated than simply just adding the gamma correction to it. These nodes are in linear space already, and so the thing with that texture input gamma, I can't really see what that's doing down here in my node editor. And Maya is very quickly adding a lot of color tools to, Autodesk is adding a lot of color tools to Maya to make this process a little bit easier. But right off the bat, I'm in Maya 2014. I'm a little bit behind. Maya 2016 just came out. But in general, I actually prefer to work and know that where my gamma correction, or that my gamma correction is happening at the end of a chain of something like this. You can see, I just dialed my colors right here. And if I was to render this sphere again, I've gone back to a washed out image, which makes sense. Because this is technically in linear space. So you do have some options. You can, it's it's a good idea to add that texture input gamma. But if you want to just not add the texture input gamma on the file node and just create a gamma correction and just set it to 0.454 here, that is also fine. The reason that's fine, and you can see now we've got that detail back in there. The reason that's fine is because even though there are rules about the linear workflow, this aspect of it is slightly subjective. Whatever you see on the viewer, if this is correct to you, then it's correct. If you realize that you wanted to set the gamma to 0.6 instead of 0.454 because you liked it being a little more washed out, then that's okay. So when you really start to get an understanding of a linear workflow, you'll find that you do actually have some options. And so that's kind of what I want this section of the video to be about, is showing both of these ways. So you can actually see I could even still apply the texture input gamma right there. And now I'll get that to be even a little bit darker. So now that's getting corrected, going in, and then getting corrected again. So I guess that's not really ideal. It's actually kind of silly to do that. But it's definitely worth understanding that you can add this gamma correction either on the front end right at the file texture input or right before it goes into your shader so that you can see the correct color that you're intending to get through this ramp, for example. You really only want to use this texture input gamma when you're dealing with something that's being viewed on the actual frame buffer. So as an example, if I was going in and taking this remap ramp and putting it into the reflection glossiness, I don't really want to have that be gamma corrected. I want that to be exactly the value that I put in. So if I want a glossiness value of 0.5 to 0.6, those values need to go in linear space so that 0.5 means 0.5. Doesn't mean 0.5 going through a gamma correction. It means literally 0.5. So let's actually turn on our reflection and let's actually play with this a little bit. We'll dial that up. And now let's render that and you can see what I mean. So that's now giving me exactly the result I expected, where it's slightly darker, it's a softer reflection, and where it's in the brighter part of the image, it's a sharper reflection. So in Vray 3, that's really all there is to it. We need to go in and add gamma corrections to file textures that require them. For example, this 8-bit TIFF that I've got going in. That 8-bit TIFF is going into diffuse color, and because it's going into diffuse color, it's showing up in my render view, so I need to have it gamma corrected. Otherwise, it'll look washed out. And if your file texture is going into one of these scalar values that aren't really, visible per se in the render view, they don't need a gamma correction because the value that you have in the image is going to be the value that's driving some properties. So in general, when you're looking at V-Ray itself, if you see a color swatch, so like self-illumination, diffuse color, reflection color, refraction color, generally you need to have your gamma correction applied since you're going to be viewing that stuff in the actual render view. Bump map is the one exception to that little rule where it does have a color swatch right here because it accepts normal maps, but you'd never want to gamma correct a regular 8-bit bump map like that. If it's an EXR bump map, you may, it may be a different story depending on what's coming in. But in general, you really never want to gamma correct a bump map. They're usually in the state they already need to be in because they're more like values that are driving attributes in the render rather than something dealing with color. One of the new features, I guess actually lack of features in Vray 3, if you saw my previous video about Vray, in the Vray tab, there is, in the color mapping advanced, there's this linear workflow checkbox. Now this linear workflow checkbox actually means that Vray is automatically applying a gamma correction of 0.454 on the inputs of the shaders. So no matter what is happening in front of that shader, it's going to get gamma corrected in the diffuse color slot. And it's automatically added it to a bunch of the slots already, like diffuse color, reflection color. Long story short, what changed is they're getting rid of this. The linear workflow checkbox is in. You can see if I render with it turned on right now, I get a little warning here. It says linear workflow option is deprecated and will be removed. Depending on when you see this video, if there's been an update to Vray 3 or if we're on Vray 3.5, it may already be gone. But if you were using this in the past, you do want to make sure that that a scene or asset gets retuned so that it's not using this linear workflow checkbox anymore. And you just leave it off. And you work with gamma nodes and using the texture input gamma right here. So it's definitely a lot more legwork that way. You have to manage your file textures and it requires a little bit of work. But in general, it's a more physically correct way of dealing with gamma, and you have full control over what you're doing. This effect swatches checkbox is kind of nice. Makes it so that your actual render swatch here, you can see, there we go. So now I've got that sRGB, that same sRGB that I've got over here is also going to affect over here. So you can see now these two guys are matched 1-to-1, which is a really nice feature. Something else slightly different here, they changed the name of this mode, so you do want to have it set to color mapping only, no gamma, and that's now the default value. So what that means is that it's not going to be baking in any gamma changes into your actual render, your EXR that you kick out. It's just simply going to be for display purposes only in the way it's handling this stuff. So it's really nice in Vray 3. It's a much easier process to be working linear, a lot less checkboxes than it used to be. All of the settings that are in there are working pretty well by default. So you can just go ahead and have a crack at it, and we're going to be working linearly from here on out. So next up, we're going to talk about the adaptive DMC in our image sampler section.